Welcome to another episode of the Harder to Breathe podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Dusick. I was the founding drummer of Maroon 5, but I'm now a registered therapist, author, and mental health advocate. With me, as always, is my co-host, Duck Maillard. How you doing, Duck?
Good, buddy. I'm glad we got the memo for the cream-colored polos. Looks great.
Well, I'll be honest. When I was getting dressed today for this episode, I was thinking about the fact that we have a Harvard professor on the show.
So no Soundgarden t-shirts?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, I wore the glasses, if you noticed. I was like,
Okay.
I need him to take me seriously as an academic.
I kind of have like a 50s like Brill cream thing going on with my hair today. So yeah, maybe I subconsciously wanted to spiff up too. Didn't have.
I think it's only natural that you think of your audience. When
you want to impress a Harvard professor. Although I could go the other way and just, you think you're better than me, Mr. Harvard? I know you. I'm down in the comments. Anyway.
Yeah. You like apples?
Yeah, exactly. I got a Harvard story for you. No, our guest couldn't have been more lovely today. We just finished our conversation with Dr. David Rosmarin, and to give a little bit of his resume, because I don't have it in front of me, but it's pretty impressive what this guy does.
Yeah, well, he's a PhD, a clinical psychologist, a scientist, an educator, an author. He's written a series of books. Some of them are more specifically about anxiety. Some are more specifically about faith and spirituality. He comes from the Jewish tradition, but he talks about spirituality and religion in general. And it's unique the way that he kind of blends those two
Ties
worlds.
those worlds together, yeah.
The sort of scientific, evidence-based approach to therapy and to mental health, and then the spiritual traditions. But he's a professor at Harvard. He's the program director of McLean Hospital, and he's the founder and director of the Center for Anxiety, which has locations in multiple states. So he's got his fingers in a lot of different pots. Is that the
I don't think so. I think you just made up a new analogy. But
a lot of different.
Honestly, I mean, I can speak for the listeners too. I mean, it's easy. We've had some incredible guests in the last couple of weeks. Sarah Bareilles was on, Brent Smith from Shinedown was on, producer Rob Cavallo is going to be on. It's coming up, and sometimes I think there's a well, I don't know who this person is. This is a clinical medical health professional, but I think it's a great contrast or counterpoint to those guests who are talking with their experiences in the music business, whatever, versus someone who comes at it from the clinical side like you do and can give not only a different perspective, but like actionable things that listeners can do to deal with anxiety and stuff. It turns out to be just a great conversation. So if there was any trepidation of like, maybe I don't want to listen to this episode because I don't know this guy, trust me, it's worth listening to, because there's a lot packed into this.
Well, what's been so interesting for me with all the different kinds of guests that we've had is just seeing how the voices can be so different in terms of the backgrounds that people come from and the perspectives. And, you talk to a guy like this who obviously does have a lot of very academic understanding of these things and can speak in that professorial way. And then he has that religious, spiritual background that he speaks from. When you talk to someone who's more in the business realm, and they have just a very different sort of approach and attitude in terms of how they approach their life and being successful in whatever that means for them. And then you talk to an artist. We've had conversations with like Morley, for instance, or with Sarah, and they're just able to open up and gush from a much more sensitive, vulnerable place that just feels like they're laying their soul on the table. And it's just like,
even though the perspective is different, the message time and time again, I think this is what you were probably about to say, is that we keep coming back to the same message. So go ahead, you pick up on that.
Yes, no, exactly. Is that it's the themes are universal. It's just that we realize people have different experiences and different ways of relating to their experience of being in their own mind and relating to the world. Because people come from different backgrounds culturally, come from different environments, and then just have different temperaments, the way that they sort of move through the world. But we're all really essentially dealing with the same things and just trying to figure out how we navigate those things. And so I find it really fascinating to get all those different perspectives, and to notice as we're doing an interview, like, oh, this is different than what we've had before. And then how are we going to engage with this, and where's the commonality? Where's the crossover?
Mm-hmm. And I think it keeps us on our toes, like you say, as hosts, but it also, like those universal themes show you that even without a clinical background or training, you figure these things out on your own. We learn that it feels good to talk to a friend about this stuff, and you don't need a therapist to tell you need to talk about this. You know what I mean? So it's useful. And we share some stories today on this episode that got me thinking about, fundamental, foundational moments in my mind. And I wanted to tell you a story that I often think back to in terms of, I'm not a comedian, a stand-up per se, but there is a lot of that element to what I do in terms of using humor to deflect and to, make people not focus on me when I was a kid, it was like not focus on me as a nerd or as a target to bullies. And I remember a very specific moment you were talking about foundational moments. So I went to a very small school that had a gymnasium, lunchroom, and auditorium all in one room. It was a multipurpose room. So there's a basketball floor, but then there were tables that folded into the wall. So they pulled them out for lunch, and then there was a stage at the end. So at the end of basketball season, they would take all the stuff that was left in the lockers and put it on stage. And during lunch, they'd be like, okay, men's basketball, boys basketball, go up and grab your stuff. Well, every other kid, their parents, they didn't work. And so they would pick them up after practice every day and they'd have their stuff with them. Well, my mom was a single parent and she worked. So I had to walk home from school, and I didn't feel like walking home with my school clothes in my bag and my basketball clothes on. So I would just walk home in my basketball clothes. Even in the middle of winter, I was in like shorts walking home. So by the end of the year, I had dozens of pants and shoes and, everything left in my locker. So when they cleaned out the lockers that day, they were like, go get your stuff. So, this guy, Kevin, who was not nice to me, went up and grabbed a pair of shorts, pair of sneakers. Jason, I went up and I grabbed my pants. Then I grabbed another pair of pants, then t-shirt. I had just a handful of clothes as from my waist to my head, I could barely see. And the entire school was there having lunch. And the eighth graders, I want to say it's the eighth graders, but they started chanting loser, loser. And then the kindergartners all the way down, everybody joined in, and it was the 80s. And like my gym teacher was like, don't look at me. And I was like, can you help me? And he gave me a garbage bag, and I had to put all my clothes in a garbage bag, and I carried them around like a trash Santa all day. And at the end of the day, I couldn't get on the bus because it was too wide to get through the bus. I mean, it was just like the entire day was just one nightmare after another, one nightmare. And I remember that feeling of like, I better turn this into something like quick. I better make this a joke. And I did. I became like, trash Santa was the joke that I remember telling myself. And I think about that now, to turn this around to something that we can talk about. I think about that now as moments for my son, as he's in his final year in elementary school. He's going to go into middle school, which is when things start getting real. Middle school is 6th, 7th, 8th grade. It's kids are starting to get a little meaner, and the kids have cliques and things like that. And I can prepare him as much as I can, but there's starting to be a lot of pushback from him in terms of, he's a tween. He's like, I don't want to listen to you. And it's tough for me to be like, no, I'm different. I'm the cool dad. I know what's coming. I can help you. And he just doesn't want to listen because he's got to figure it out on his own. And I understand that. But like, I don't know how to reconcile myself with that, with not wanting him to go through what I went through. I think my parents weren't even aware of it because it was generationally, it was very different. They weren't plugged into day-to-day activities, and I don't even know if they know that story. But I know what my son goes through every day, and I want to protect him and I want to prepare him. But I feel there's an impotence to me in terms of like, there's only so many things you can do. You have to kind of get out of the way and just say, all right, you're on your own, kid. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering what advice you would give to someone who's struggling with that as a parent, to want to have influence on your child's life, as opposed to previous generations who were like, I don't know what my kid's doing. Yeah. But also realizing that there's only so much I can do. He's got to take the reins on his own and find his place in this world.
Well, I think my response is going to hit on a conversation that we have later in this episode with Dr. Rosmarin. What you're describing is so common, I think, as a parent. However, what you're describing is essentially wanting to have control over something that you have no control over.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that well-meaning parents, and it's probably similar to my experience with my parents, because they were very well-meaning and very wanting to protect me from pain, and to an extent that was probably a bit overbearing in terms of insulating me from things that were uncomfortable. I mean, it wasn't as bad.
I would have rather have had that, by the way, than the alternative, which is what I had.
And if you had to choose, and I'm not complaining about that at all. I'm just saying, it's almost with parenting, it's like you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. It's like either if you go too far in either direction, you end up with a problem. It's like if you are hands off and it's just laissez-faire, obviously that's going to be no good. If you're really too strict and trying to make sure that you enforce discipline on everything, that ends up being a problem. If you try to be their best friend and protect them from pain and just completely smother them with love, like that's the best of those options, but you do end up with other problems. So I think for me, I did end up probably lacking in the ability to build my own resilience because I didn't have to struggle through things as much. But the advice that I would give is first and foremost the acceptance of the limitations of what you can control. Because no matter how hard you try, you can't protect him from dealing with life. Yeah. Right. I mean, he's at a certain point, he's going to have to deal with certain realities, and that doesn't have to be a negative thing. I mean, these foundational things. that was a moment when you learned a skill set, right?
Quickly on the fly.
And that became a coping style for you. Humor became a coping style, and it became a part of your personality. And so while that was a traumatic experience, it sounds like, it was also a moment where you discovered a piece of yourself and something that was a strength of yours. So that is something that comes from those moments as well. And I think that the best thing you can do as a parent is not solve all of your child's problems for them.
You have no idea. I mean, I it's something I struggle with now, that I feel when he was like an infant, I feel like I'd give him 2 chances at a puzzle and be like, no, let daddy show you. It goes like this. And I regret it now because I feel like he doesn't. I say this all the time. My wife's like, you're overreacting. I'm like, no, I feel like we didn't prepare him with problem solving skills. I feel like I fixed things too easily for him. I should have let him struggle more. I should have let him, not succeed until he finally put in the work to figure it out. Because I feel like he gives up too easily now. I was like, I can't do this, Dad. You do it. I'm like, all right. So yes, that's a big point that you just touched on.
Well, don't beat yourself up over it too badly. I mean, it's a very loving thing that you're doing. It's just that the most productive thing you can do as a parent is just to be there and to show that you care and to offer a space for them to understand that whatever they're going through, you're there to support them. You can't fix it for them. You can't shield them from whatever's going to come from life, but you can be a support system, and you can be somebody that can help them walk through it beside them. It's just listening and giving them the opportunity to share if something is difficult, because so much it's the traumatic things that happen to us in our life. Obviously, there can be really painful things that happen, but the ways in which they scar us more has to do with the ways in which we're not able to process them properly. We're not able to take them and turn them into a lesson or a moment of resilience. It's stuck in this place of shame, or it's a secret, or it's something that you just feel like a way in which you failed, or you take responsibility and guilt for what happened yourself. Like if I was cooler, if I was not a loser, then
I wasn't
that wouldn't
trash
have
Santa.
right. But the reality is that if you are offered the opportunity to process it, if you are offered that love, that somebody cares and can validate your experience, even if it's a painful experience. Yeah. That's the beginning of healing from it and turning it into a formative experience of future resilience and future perspective.
As opposed to some horrible memory, core memory that is like my villain origin story. which very easily could have been. So.
Well, I have a friend who is a great trauma specialist therapist. Yeah.
What's that like?
You're not my only friend, Doug. Okay. I apologize.
How dare
you? I have a good friend who's a really, I think, a special clinician, a trauma specialist, and she specializes in a few different things in that realm. And she told me something early on in my development as a therapist, which was really helpful. And she said, it's not always what was done to you, it's what was not done for you.
Mm-hmm.
So you hear, I mean, to take it to a more tragic extreme, you hear stories of somebody who, a child who was abused in some way, and they go to their parents and they say, this happened, and they deny it, or they don't want to hear it. It's too painful. They don't want to deal with it. Or they say, oh, you're just being dramatic, or that kind of thing. That is more scarring because you're invalidating their pain and their emotional experience.
Sure.
And now it's stuck in that place of shame. And that's when it does become a formative experience of trauma, but even those sort of like really painful things that can happen to you in life, if in that moment it turns into love, if it turns into someone is there to support you and help you through that moment, and you're able to process it and recognize that it wasn't your fault, and that you are safe, and that this was an isolated incident of something bad that happened, but it's not defining of you. It's not because of you, that you are loved, that you are, that you have more to define you than that moment. Then it can become empowering. The things that are really painful and traumatic can become a source of wisdom and growing in your life. It's not that we avoid pain altogether, we avoid trauma. It's that as a parent, you just are offering them the support and the guidance to help them walk through it, but not do it for them.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I remember you mentioned on a previous episode that revelation that when your arm hurt on the mound and a coach didn't look out for you, a coach wasn't there for you, that was a really, pivotal moment in your life. And I think it's something we talk about a little bit on this episode today, but it's come up again in the past of this. We're not avoiding trauma, and we're not avoiding anxiety, and we're not avoiding all these things, but it's how we deal with it that changes our perspective of it. It's a paradigm shift of rather than being upset that this happened to me, let's look at it critically and say, okay, why did this happen? Who was there for me? What did I learn from it? And we can turn it into a positive thing. And so, yes, I agree that trying to be here, all I can do is be here for my son when he's ready to reach out to me and say, hey, a really rough thing happened at school today. And hopefully I have laid the foundation of being the dad that he is comfortable sharing that with me. So that's work that I've done beforehand, even before we come up to a traumatic event like this. So I think we're in a good position to do that. It's just, it's a tough place to be in, of giving up that control and that power and saying, I've got to let him go, and I've got to let him figure a lot of this out on his own. And when he needs my help and my advice, I hope that I have, built the foundation where he feels safe and comfortable doing that. So, and I think I have, so we'll see.
I'm sure you have. And I have another brief analogy that I think is helpful here that I share with clients that are parents of, in particular, teenagers, because get ready. It's going to get rougher.
You mean it's not going to get easier? Interesting.
Well, here's the thing. It is par for the course, and it is age appropriate at a certain point that your child doesn't want to hear your advice anymore, and doesn't want your help, and they want to establish autonomy and independence, and they think, and also at a certain point as a teenager, you just think you know everything, right? So that's part of it. And as a parent, that can be really maddening because whereas up until a certain point you were holding their hand through everything, now they're separating and letting go of that hand, and that you feel this barrier between you, this wall that comes up. And the analogy is just that. You're walking up until this point, holding hands with your child, walking them through life, and at a certain point, there is a concrete wall that comes between you when they reach a certain age of adolescence, and you have to let go of the hand, and you can't even see them at a certain point. They're on the other side of this wall. You're still walking beside each other on either side of this wall. You just don't have access to them in the way that you used to. But what you do as a parent is you scribble notes. You try to yell over the walls for them to hear. You can't tell if they're listening to anything you're saying. You scribble notes, you throw it over, and you get no confirmation that they even read the note or anything. And you continue to do that for a series of years as they sort of discover their own 2 feet to walk on and their own place in the world. At a certain point, whether it's at 18 or 20 or 22 or 25, you realize that wall has ended and that you're standing and you can see that person again, and they've grown up a bit and they've been through a lot, and maybe they're a little weathered. They've weathered the storm a little bit, and you begin to re-engage, and now you can embrace them again. And sometimes it takes a little bit for them to come back and to realize my parent isn't my enemy, and they're not trying to ruin my life by giving me advice. And then they'll say something to you at that moment, whatever age that is, 18, 25, 35, whatever it is. They tell you something and you go, oh, they got that letter that I threw over. They did read it. I couldn't tell then, but they did read it. And that only happens if you're patient, if you continue to be there and just be selfless in your ability to be a support system and offer guidance without trying to do it for them. And just give them that opportunity to come to you when they're ready to come to you. It's not that they're not listening. It's not that it doesn't get in there. It's just that it's part of that period of growth that we all went through.
Yeah.
And if you're lucky enough to have a parent like you that is invested enough to try to be that, when you do look back on it as an adult, you recognize that and how difficult that was. And so I think that analogy, I think, is helpful for a lot of parents to recognize, like, this is par for the course, and it doesn't mean that my effort isn't helpful. It just means that it's a different form now than it was when they were 8.
Yeah. Yeah. I like to, I mean, patience is a thing that I definitely need to work on, especially with him. But I mean, there's only so many times I can hear him not be able to get the top on the water bottle and the ice cubes drop on the floor. I mean, how hard is it to get a water bottle top on and not spill water all over my floor? And then if you spill the water on the floor, to get a paper towel and clean it up. Sorry. We've touched on a very triggering moment for me. But we'll deal with that on another episode. I appreciate it. I like I said, I do try to have that patience, and I know that the messages are getting through. He's not full-fledged tween yet. He still acknowledges and, appreciates and tells me, that he does hear those things. But I know those days are coming, so I'm banking these good memories and good feelings for the years that I'm going to need that.
Yeah, enjoy it.
Thank you.
All right. So a lot of great conversation on this episode. And our guest, Dr. David Rosmarin, is great. So you're going to enjoy this interview a lot, I think.
And if you have any questions for Ryan or for the Trash Santa, drop them at hardertobreathepodcast@gmail.com. I can tell you the best way to carry a bag of clothes home on your back if they won't fit on the bus.
I would start calling you Trash Santa from now on, but that sounds a little too cruel.
But you know what? I've got a thick skin. I built it up. I use comedy, so it's all good. Call me what you want. Call me what you will.
It's the name you gave yourself, so
it's true. I'm
owning
owning it, taking it back.
Yes. All right. Without further ado, our conversation with Dr. David Rosmarin on the Harder to Breathe podcast. Dr. David Rosmarin, welcome to the Harder to Breathe podcast. How are you today?
Great. At least good. I'm great to start with. I don't know if I'm going to have trouble breathing at some point, but
we're going to do a deep dive and get to the trauma.
I know.
That's the fun.
So I want to today get into a lot of the great work that you're doing. But to start out, I kind of just want to, I've been looking you up online and looking at all the things you're doing and the center that you started, and it's all wonderful, but I couldn't find a lot about your background and kind of, the sort of origin story of how you came to do what you do. So I'm curious, how did you end up in the field of mental health and doing the things that you're doing? Was this a passion from a young age? Was there anything personal about this choice of field?
Yeah, not a passion from a young age at all. I was heading into law, business, and pushing ahead with it, and had a pretty vicious panic attack at age 18, 19. And it was a real life alterer. I said, you know what? I gotta stop people from having this. This is not okay. And it changed course for me. And I said, you know what? I want to do this. Became a clinical psychologist and a professor, right? Started an anxiety treatment center. And I learned a lot more about anxiety along the way. I met myself too, so.
What was the, sorry, already I'm jumping in with question. What was the situation that led to the panic attack? Like, what were you doing?
Yeah, I was taking a test. I was taking an exam, and it was a high stakes exam. I was not prepared for it. I took my professional life pretty seriously, which has been good. It pushed me forward, and I still, to this day, I've used that. But at the same time, I really wasn't acknowledging, my feelings enough and able to delve into them and manage them. So they got ahead of me.
Been there.
We all have.
Were you a nervous person growing up, or was this just a new thing that happened all of a sudden at this point in your life?
I don't think I was, and maybe that's part of it. I think in high school I kind of goofed around, and even before then. And then at a certain point, I guess it was early adulthood, right? 18, 19. I was like, I really got to get my act together. And I like surged forward and then hit this roadblock. And I'm like, oh no, and that was sort of in retrospect, probably what happened. But I'm really glad it did. It taught me a ton, put me on course.
So what was it that helped you? Was it a certain type of therapy, or how did you work through that?
Not really. I think a lot of it's really been through my professional work. I surged forward and tried to understand. I really tried to study the hell out of this. What is it about anxiety? Why do people experience it? How can we understand it better? And it was a long process. I think in part because a lot of what I was hearing and studying was get rid of anxiety. It's not a good thing, which is what I thought going in. And it was only when I realized that this is a human emotion. We are all going to have it. And how can you actually use it in a constructive way? That was when things really changed. That took like 20 years, longer, 25 years for me to come to that conclusion. Just because it's so at odds with what the other messages that are out there.
And also just the instinctual response is that we want this feeling out of our bodies. We don't, when we have a broken leg, we want it healed. We don't want to figure out how to live with a broken leg. But anxiety is unique in a way that we are learning, as you're talking about, that it can be something that can be used as a positive. You can apply it towards your life and figure out ways to utilize that anxiety for a positive. So.
For sure. To be clear, there are clinical forms of anxiety which are more akin to a broken leg, where you really do need professional help to be able to do that. It's not going to be a cast and and surgery. It's going to be more like psychotherapy and maybe medication. But there are definitely, at a certain point, anxiety is akin to those issues. But there's a certain level of stress and anxiety that we all experience that's uncomfortable. It's uncontrollable. It's going to happen. And that's actually a very good thing. That type of typical non-clinical anxiety, I'll call it. That's something we need to learn to grapple with in our lives, and can enhance our lives when we stop trying to get rid of it, when we accept it and change our relationship with it.
It was a turning point for me because I was one of those people who had clinically, significant anxiety. I was having panic attacks pretty much on a daily basis. I'd become pretty much totally agoraphobic. I couldn't really be around other people unless I was drinking or taking some kind of anti-anxiety pill. And so I wanted to get rid of it. I saw it only as a detriment to me, something that was not helpful in any way. And I just wanted to be free of this thing that was a burden to me. In recovery from alcoholism and this acute anxiety, I discovered there was a more manageable version of anxiety that it was a mindset shift that was really helpful of understanding. I call it nature's performance enhancer. It's like when you're walking into a situation, I'm a baseball guy. If you're trying to hit a 100-mile-an-hour fastball, like you need a little bit of that rush. You need to be on edge and have those butterflies. Any pro would tell you you're not going to be able to execute to the highest level unless you are able to rise to the occasion with that extra little bit of nerves, kind of propelling you forward. So when I understood it in that way, I realized like there's a spectrum here. It's not all bad, and it's a part of life that can be utilized to actually enhance the things that you do.
Well, I'm glad you got to that conclusion a lot quicker than I did.
No,
it took him a while.
Yeah. Well, it was quick in recovery, but it was after a couple decades of suffering that I got to that point.
Got it. Okay, I guess I would have picked the schooling route over suffering that badly, but it's an amazing conclusion. I came to the same conclusion, and you've quite the story.
It's interesting that you said that it was the study of this stuff that was helpful to you, really kind of helped you work through it, because I found that to be the case too. I was already in my own recovery. However, I was maybe 2 or 3 years into my recovery when I went back to school to study clinical psychology. And I found that it was my work, my academic work, that it felt like I was in kindergarten studying how to get over anxiety, and then I was in grad school studying how to get over anxiety. And
I love that.
And so that's interesting. You've done a lot in your career thus far. You've written a series of books, and founded, and you're the director of the Center for Anxiety, as well as a professor at Harvard, and a number of other things. What I found really unique about what I'm reading about you is that you have this Center for Anxiety that's evidence-based, state of the art, and helpful to people in terms of the clinical aspects of working through anxiety. However, you also talk a lot about in your books about the spiritual element, which is not necessarily an evidence-based practice, but and traditionally not something that you would see brought into that realm. The two would maybe be separate. You would either seek out a priest or a rabbi or a shaman, or you would seek out a therapist, and maybe not both together at the same time. So tell me how you sort of bring those two worlds together, how that makes sense to you as both a clinician and a man of faith.
Sure. In the Harvard system, this is what I study full time on which is spirituality and mental health. How are these two related? And I've taken also a studious approach to this as well, very academic, and actually doing scientific research on this subject. Just anecdotally, it's amazing here at McLean Hospital and Harvard system is in eastern Massachusetts, right? One of the least religious enclaves in the entire country. Yet more than half of the patients who come to the hospital where I work, McLean Hospital, which is an incredible psychiatric facility, profess having spiritual needs and wanting to address those in the treatment process. So I think, and by the way, the majority of those, the statistical majority of those individuals are not religious, to your point beforehand. So people often come to mental health concerns with spiritual questions. What is the meaning of my life? Why am I here? Right? Existential issues. They often have spiritual struggles, right? Large looming issues, and also just a need to connect and to make sense. I think that's at a broad level. At a specific level, I think these two worlds are very connected. In the medical sort of especially a biomedical model, you jumped before to a broken leg analogy. When we have a disease, when we have a problem, we need to get rid of it and eradicate it and stop it completely. From a spiritual perspective, that's true, but there's a reason why. There's something there to learn from. There's some positive piece. And you can see that across any religious tradition. At any non-religious spiritual tradition, there's a rhyme, there's a reason, there's something positive here, right? These are very classic spiritual concepts that are broad. If you apply that to mental health, it really dovetails well into the conversation we were having before, which is the fact that I'm distressed right now. I'm not going to say anxiety is fun. It sucks. Have a pit in your stomach, short of breath, sweating, the discomfort, the confusion, the worries in your mind, difficulty sleeping. I mean, when I'm stressed out, I go there. We all do. It's not fun. I'm not saying it's pleasant, but those moments can create humility. They can create better connection with others, and they can make us more resilient. And to your point, even enhance our performance. So I do think a broad spiritual perspective on this is a functional aspect, even though it's upsetting, is by and large better when dealing with at least non-clinical anxiety than the biomedical approach.
So do you lean on your Jewish faith in that, or is there a particular realm of spirituality that you bring into the work that you do, or is it just kind of you approach the client where they're at?
Okay, so professionally, it's for sure with the client where they're at.
Right.
Personally, in my own life, I mean, my Jewish faith has had huge impact on my conceptualization, my understanding of myself, my world, my family, and also practice. This is something that's part of my life. I've used it to let go of certain expectations, to embrace anxiety, to identify what it's upset about, and to share it. And those core elements are not specific to Judaism. I think you find them in many faith traditions and in many spiritual but non-religious traditions. So there's a language here and concepts that I think are way broader than just the Jewish world. And And I mean, the vast majority of patients that I'm dealing with in this arena are not Jewish or religious at all.
For speaking my own personal experience, I'm not religious at all. I wasn't raised religious. And I find when I was going through my worst struggles in my 20s, I still find the same philosophical questions that you bring up. Like, what is the point of this? Why am I doing this? What is my reason for being here? And finding answers to that in practice, in repetition of service to others and things like that. Tenets of every major religion. Like I agree that it doesn't necessarily have to be a particular religion or spirituality, but it's the same questions that are brought up in those worlds. And so I think, filling those holes that we find in us as human beings is a universal experience. It's not exclusive to religion.
I fully agree.
Yeah, just I'm just driving home your point. Yeah.
There's another element here. Part of, I think, dealing with anxiety, it teaches us that we do need to accept the limits of our control and at some point to let go.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And when we're hitting anxiety, it's often because I'm going to take you back to my experience. I wanted to do this test. I felt like I needed to do this test, and the test wasn't going well. And I'm feeling very anxious about that. And I had to actually take a step back from the test and have my panic attack and then go back to it. And, at a certain point, though, not even at a certain point, had I let go more and said, like, okay, this isn't going well, and maybe it's not for me, or maybe I have to think about this differently, as opposed to forcing it, it would have taken the edge off entirely. I think that's something that almost all spiritual traditions have. Instead of maintaining an illusion of control and knowledge, just recognizing that we're only human, and we don't only need to be human.
Mm-hmm.
There's not more which is expected of us. There's a freedom that comes from that letting go.
Mm-hmm.
Jesus, take the wheel, right?
Okay.
Well, I've kind of run the gamut in my personal relationship with religion and spirituality, and it continues to evolve for me. And I do see it as a part of my mental health, because I look at mental health as holistic. It's mind, body, and spirit.
Sure.
I think that I have sort of an existential perspective on spirituality, because I look at it personally as a construct. Like, we each have our own sort of way of relating to that thing that is hard to describe otherwise, right? It's that eternal question that will never be answered in a very tangible way. It's only something that we can believe in or have faith in. And at least in this lifetime, we never receive like ultimate confirmation as to whether we're right on point or sort of in the ballpark in terms of our understanding of it. So for me, like as a kid, I was raised Jewish as well.
Sure.
My dad's family is Jewish. And I was bar mitzvahed at 13. And right around that age, I had my first sort of existential crisis, where I questioned everything. I was like, wait a second, this is just something I've been taught my whole life. It's one way of thinking. I don't know if I necessarily believe it. It's just what I was supposed to do. I was supposed to go to Hebrew school. I was supposed to study to read from the Torah. And I finally did it. And I'm like, I don't know what it all means. Is this what I believe in? And I think that's a natural thing that we all go through at different phases of life, where we kind of start to question things. In particular, as a teenager, I think, as an adolescent. But at the same time, it was the time when anxiety entered my life. And I do see the existential angst of that moment in life, when you realize like everything you've learned has been just sort of handed down to you by your parents or by your faith leaders or your teachers. And then you're trying to make sense of, what do I actually believe in? And there's this vast sort of void in terms of like, do I just buy wholesale into what somebody else is telling me, or do I have my own relationship to it? And so I kind of had to go across that spectrum throughout my life, to a point where I was totally anti-religion for a long period of my life as an adult. But I was still suffering from that existential angst of like feeling a lack of meaning in my life, feeling disconnected from something bigger than myself, especially in my addiction, especially in my years of intense anxiety. And it wasn't until I was in recovery from those things, and in a 12-step program, which was not a specific spiritual teaching, but it was an idea that you need to connect to something larger than yourself to feel whole. That's when I started to have an appreciation for what religion and spirituality offers people, because we all have that existential angst and a need to connect to something larger than ourselves. So the working definition that I came up with for myself in terms of spirituality is that it essentially is that longing for connection, that longing for something outside of ourselves, because so much of what burdens us is the ways in which we're self-obsessed and we're fixated on this body and this mind and the experience of being in it, as opposed to letting go, as you described, to being open and connected to the world around us, to the universe around us, and if you believe in it, a God above us. So is that kind of consistent?
I love what you're saying. I mean, everything you're saying is resonating, especially the issue that, we all grapple with very deep questions. Maybe not all, but almost everyone at some point is going to be asking them, like, is this my path in life? Is this what's my why? Like, what, am I being authentic to myself? Like, am I just inheriting something from my parents, like you said, or is this something that I really want to do? Like, who am I and what's my place in this universe? Those are big questions. And I think in many ways, spirituality gets us to think about them, not to avoid them. And the inherent stress and struggle that comes up when we address those actually makes us more whole. It can make us more whole if we grapple with those questions and come up with an answer that really makes sense, which is a process. It's a process for everyone.
And it's also the concept that the journey is the destination. Like
I love that.
That is what being human is, that search for answering those questions. And maybe we don't, like Ryan said, we don't have a final answer until it's all over and done with. But the part of the fun is trying to figure it out along the way.
Yeah, I don't know if it's always fun.
Maybe when you get to a place of revelation where you actually figure some things out, whether it's spiritually, clinically, etc., then the fun can begin. How about that?
Hope so.
Yeah.
Yeah, for me, I think that the existential perspective that you mentioned helps me a lot in terms of meaning in life is elusive, and essentially coming to the understanding that we have the ability to choose what life means to us. We have the ability to choose purpose, and it can be choosing to invest in a religion. It can be choosing to invest in a purpose that drives what you do during your life. But realizing that existential angst that we all feel, while if we're sitting around waiting for something to fill that void, we might wait forever. But if we choose to fill that void with something purposeful, feel like my faith drives me to do good acts, or my belief in myself drives me to accomplish things in my life, or to be a good parent or a good partner, then your life begins to be filled with meaning in ways that otherwise might be daunting. And so that, to me, is such a big part of mental health. And when you're invested in purpose in that way, it alleviates a lot of the anxiety of living.
No question.
I think it's as a patient, you guys are clinicians. You come at it with experience and with rigorous scientific testing. But as an amateur who's going through something, sometimes I just want to be told, do these 3 things. They may not feel good in the moment, but trust us. We have empirical evidence and history of seeing other patients who go through it, that these things help. So whether it's, like you say, being of service, exercising, just talking about it, find a friend and talk about it, you will find that, trust us, those things work. And it's very helpful to someone who's going through something that they may not understand yet, certainly not on the level that you gentlemen do. That these are the tools, at least in the beginning, can help just kind of creep out of that really deep shadow of whether it be depression, anxiety, whatever. It's really useful to guys like me who don't know where to start.
So tell me, should I call you David or Dr. Rosmarin? Which one is?
David's much better.
Okay. So David, program director at McLean Hospital, professor at Harvard, founder and director of the Center for Anxiety, author of several books. What order did these things come in? Like, how did you find all of those different avenues? I'm curious because you have purpose in your life. You have drive to accomplish certain things. And we like to hear from people who are able to perform at that level, like having a background of anxiety and walking through these. Like, what was the order of operations to what came first? How did you get to where you're at now?
chronologically or existentially? I mean, how are we asking here? I think it's a journey for everyone. I came to Boston as a psychology intern. I ended up staying here for a postdoctoral fellowship, and when I was done, ended up getting some philanthropic funding to start a program here on spirituality and mental health. I was not going to give that up. That was, very much a dream for me to be able to explore these issues and to study it at a high level within the academy, and to be able to be a part of McLean Hospital was just a dream. At the same time, concurrently that year, when I finished my postdoctoral fellowship, an opportunity came up to start an anxiety clinic in New York City, which was also too difficult to pass up. So I ended up commuting down there for a day a week, which worked out in the end very well, but at the same time has been, when I started, as you can imagine, this was extremely stressful and my anxiety hit new heights, which ended up being good because I learned a lot about anxiety, which dovetailed into both my spiritual understanding and creating methods to help people with anxiety. But it was definitely full of challenges and full of heart palpitations and full of sweaty moments along the way. I kind of just dove right into both after getting my license. Have managed to survive. There was a couple of near misses though along the way. Let me tell you.
Do you see clients as a clinician, or are you just a director of these programs?
Not anymore. I'll tell you what I do. I do like intensive assessments. It's usually between 5 and 10 hours of work, so it's pretty comprehensive. It's for people who are really stuck in their mental health journey, who need, usually complicated cases. So I'll meet with their clinicians, I'll review all their files, I'll meet with however many family members are required, and then vet, potential clinicians for their next step if needed, although that's not always needed. And then sometimes I'll get involved on a concierge basis to keep things on the rails going forward. But it's pretty minimal. I'm not doing therapy anymore. I used to do 25 hours of therapy a week, providing. At this point, it's really only the assessment piece and then speaking and consulting kind of work.
So tell us more about the Center for Anxiety. Tell what it's in multiple states right now. You serve over 1,000 patients a year. Yeah,
it's closer to 1,500 actually at this point. Yeah, there are multiple offices. The New York offices, there are several there, and now it's sort of followed me back to Massachusetts. So there's a couple offices here as well. It's about 65 staff in total, and we're just doing really good work helping with people with clinical anxiety. It's somewhere between outpatient and sort of higher level of care. So we can see people multiple times per week if they need, and really provide a lot of intensive outpatient individual psychotherapy. And the philosophy is helping people to get resilience, helping them to get their relationships more sorted out. And if people want to explore more existential, spiritual concepts, that's there, although that's certainly not the focus. For a lot of people have those questions, and we're prepared for it. I think unlike a lot of other practices, it's sort of part of the culture, but it's not like a main offering per se.
Can I ask a little bit, just some technical questions to both of you, just because it's something that I recently learned about in helping a friend through a bit of a crisis. The different levels of treatment. You mentioned real quick the intensive outpatient procedures, where, I think one of the things that's daunting to people who are going through a major mental health crisis is, I'm going to get committed to a mental hospital. Like, that's the concept of, like, I'm going to get locked up and I have no say in my treatment, things like that. What are the options for people who are really going through an intense issue that they need to address immediately, but maybe they have a life that they can't go away for, an extended period of time into a hospital, where some of those treatment options that the center offers?
Ryan, not sure if you want to handle it. I'm happy to. Whatever
you're the guest. You're the guest. Please go ahead.
Firstly, getting committed to a mental hospital is very rare, and there are state hospitalizations. It can happen, but we're talking about at McLean we have 5,000 admissions to a psychiatric hospital per year. The vast majority are voluntary. Very few are involuntary, and of those which are involuntary, it's usually only 72 hours. The number of people who get committed to a state hospital, if it happens 5 times in an entire calendar year, that's a lot.
I think that's
so-
just the scary, like, that's what people envision when they think, I'm having a crisis and I'm going to get locked up, you know?
No, that's not how it works. The
Good.
vast majority of intensive treatments are voluntary, but there are a lot of options before then. Firstly, often people who are having a very acute crisis, even just going to therapy once, twice, having 1 or 2 sessions a week, getting maybe a pharmacological consult, sometimes a little bit of support can make a massive difference. So if people are nascent to therapy, I think it's very important for them to just go. The analogy I give is like the dentist. People go to the dentist twice a year or once a year for preventative care. But in mental health, we don't do that. Why? It makes no sense. We should. Everybody should go once or twice a year.
Get a cleaning, get a brain cleaning.
Well, at least an assessment of how many cavities there are, so to speak.
Probably a lot.
Psychic cavities.
Psychic cavities, right? Now, in the space between that once or twice a week and inpatient, which is a hospital stay, there's something called intensive outpatient. And there are different ways to do this, but basically people can go to a office setting in the morning, like 8 or 9 a.m. and stay till 2 or 3. Sometimes they'll only stay till 12. It's usually group psychotherapy, and they'll be there for a couple hours and then they go home. And that can be for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, maybe 6. In our program, it's a little less than that. It's more a lot of individual psychotherapy. So we're one of the more intensive individual psychotherapy programs. Center for Anxiety, we can see people individually 5, 6, 7 times a week with different clinicians, not all the same person. So we can provide a lot of individualized, tailored intensive outpatient, which is pretty unique. But it's in that space between the once or twice a week and hospital care. And then there's other things like adding a group or adding pharmacology. These are other things that can and often should be added to the mix.
I just think it's so helpful for our listeners to hear, because like I said, I wasn't aware of that sort of in-between level. I thought it was an all or nothing type of thing. You're either in therapy or you're locked up in a mental hospital, and you realize that there's degrees to everything. So I think it's really helpful for our listeners to hear, like I said, that there are options out there.
Yeah, especially now with neurotherapeutics like transcranial magnetic stimulation, TMS, and even ketamine. And, there's lots of different ways to go about this, which is one of the reasons I do consulting is these are your options. Let's have a conversation about what those are and actually map out something that's going to make sense at quality with minimal invasive and cost.
Great.
Well, in the spirit of making things kind of simpler for the layperson out there who's looking for options, your most recent book is called Thriving with Anxiety, 9 Tools to Make Your Anxiety Work for You. That sounds like the most sort of straightforward how-to self-help title that I could imagine for how to deal with anxiety.
How many of those steps are you going to drop on the episode today? Just give me for free.
Yeah, I'm curious if there's any sort of if that was the attempt to sort of make it simpler for the layperson, a takeaway in the form of a book, and if so, what you can share with us about some of the things that are helpful.
Yeah, I'll tell you. I mean, I could go through the 9 tools. I think that would be hard to do. I'm going to give you 4 steps if you really want to take away to do this. And this is something I've been working on recently, which simplifies the model, makes it really just doable. I think for anyone, and of course, if people have clinical anxiety, they should, get professional treatment and not just rely on these steps. But I think this is something that everybody could benefit from, and I certainly do in my life. I've been using these daily recently. So, okay, the step 1 is to identify. Often, when it comes to anxiety, we don't think about what's upsetting us. We go on to the next thing. We're on our phones. Ryan, you mentioned drinking before. Whatever it is, we drown it out. We push it out of our minds. We distract ourselves. Stop. Sit with the uncomfortable moment and actually identify, what are you afraid of? Is it failure? Is it losing a relationship? Is it losing meaning in your life? Is it losing money? And if so, then why? What's at the core of what you're really afraid of? In simple terms, what is it? If you don't know what it is, go for a walk. Don't come back until you have an answer to this question. Just take the time to make that mental inventory and just identify what you're afraid of. Step 1.
Ryan, you've done that with me. We sometimes have some little informal therapy sessions on this show where Ryan helps me break through some stuff, and he immediately is like, "Well, what are you really worried about in that case?" And I go, "Well, I'm not really worried about X, Y, and Z. It's actually this other thing." So well done, Ryan. Okay, number one.
Okay, I've read the book.
You've actually done. It sounds like you've done 1 and 2 because number 2 is to share. It's important to share it with someone else.
So everyone out there, get a podcast with a clinical therapist so you get some therapy every week. Got it. Okay.
Free therapy. Yeah. It doesn't have to be a therapist. It can be, but a confidant, a friend. Heck, tell it to a stranger. I don't really care. But somebody else, another human being, needs to hear you articulate, this is what I am afraid of. And the reason is often that comes out of your mouth. It feels very vulnerable. It's very scary. And you're afraid you're going to get judged. And the other person's like, yeah, I'm afraid of that all the time. Or like, that makes perfect sense. Like that in of itself is like, oh, I'm not crazy. Oh, nothing's wrong with me here. And just also sharing it creates just a shared experience. You're not alone in this world. You're unburdening yourself by conveying it to someone else. There's someone else to carry it on their shoulders with you. It's just a human need. We can't struggle alone. We're not supposed to struggle alone, I don't think. I think struggle is an interpersonal matter. Identify, share. Good so far?
Good.
We're with you.
All right. Number 3, embrace. Embrace the anxiety. When people feel anxious, we squelch those symptoms, try to breathe it away. We try to do whatever we can to make sure we don't feel it. I mentioned distracting yourself beforehand. We avoid things. Ryan, you mentioned agoraphobia beforehand. Right? Agoraphobia is when people are avoiding situations simply because those situations create anxiety.
Absolutely.
The main concern is I don't want to feel anxious, so I avoid going to the supermarket, driving, going on bridges, going on planes, because I don't want to feel that way. And anxiety is there to make us stronger. Just like going to the gym, it hurts, it burns, right? You're getting your cardiovascular system, you're heaving,
I wouldn't know. I'm sorry. This is all This is just natural. This is a natural, beautiful physique. Sorry.
You got it. It hurts, it burns, but that's what creates strength, physical strength. Emotional strength is the same thing. We have to allow ourselves to experience anxiety in order to harden our fortitude, our emotional. We talk about resilience all the time, but how do you build resilience? By going through an emotional challenge. There's no choice. That's the way to do it. So that's 3. Identify, share, embrace. Any guesses what number 4 is?
Run screaming and jump under your covers, under your bed.
That would be not 3.
No? Okay. Sorry. I'm not a professional, guys. I don't know.
Tell me about that. What's making you anxious right now? Let go.
Let go.
And to acknowledge the limits of what we can do and to be okay with that. To actually let go and not try to control everything, not try to know everything. To think back to what we're really, that identify point, what we're really concerned about, and to say, could I deal with that outcome? It would suck. And this is what I'm going to try to do in order to mitigate it or to bring it about. But at the end of the day, I can only do my part. And beyond that, it's not within my purview to learn to be okay with that. I think those 4 steps are really critical to dealing with any non-clinical anxiety.
So is that where the spiritual element comes in for you, is in that 4th step?
I think they're all spiritual.
Okay.
Talking to someone else, I think it's a connected experience. I think the embracing the fact that it creates resilience is a real spiritual spin on anxiety, because instead of trying to eliminate it, I'm understanding it as part of me. Even the identify, I'm not shying away from it. I'm sort of accepting these difficult questions, these difficult issues. I'm not putting it into the side of my life. I'm actually embracing those issues. I'm moving towards them. I'm thinking about it. It's hard for me to divorce a spiritual perspective from any of the 4, but you're right. I guess the 4th one is particularly and it's a human need. We love letting go, right? We love it. Take me on a roller coaster. There's an aspect of that.
Go ahead, Ray.
Well, I was just going to say that's what's fascinating to me is noticing the crossover between, you think of like cognitive behavioral therapy, for instance, as a very clinical, scientific, cognitive way of dealing with your challenges, and that the spiritual element is more mystical and that they're totally separate. Coming to the recovery from addiction and from anxiety that I did, I noticed a lot more crossover between all of the different ways of approaching these things. And it was interesting because I was inpatient and learning about the 12 steps, and then, doing traditional therapies as well. And then I was in an outpatient program that was a CBT based place. It wasn't a 12-step based place. And then realizing that a lot of the 12 steps does have a basis in spiritual traditions and religious traditions.
Sure.
As you were describing steps 1 and 2, what I was hearing in my head was steps 4 and 5 of the 12 steps, because that's where you take an inventory, your fears and your resentments, and you have to identify what it is that is the issue at hand. And step 5 is tell another human being, and it's usually your sponsor in the 12 steps, but just how much CBT there is in the 12 steps, for instance. It's a behavioral step in terms of changing the way that you're relating to the things that you're afraid of and the things that cause you anger and resentment. And I think that's, if you look at where that comes from, it's like in the Christian tradition, confessing your sins. Now, calling it sins is maybe a little bit more judgmental way to go about it.
Putting you on the 8 ball to start.
Fair enough.
Yeah. Well, in the 12 steps, they also use the term character defects, which I'm not crazy about because that sounds a little judgmental as well. But the idea of identifying what it is that's challenging you, what you're afraid of, sharing that with somebody, with another human being, whether it be your priest, your rabbi, your sponsor, your therapist,
friend,
it's all kind of the same idea, right?
Very. It's similar. I think what you're saying, I'm so glad you brought us back to 12 steps. Did you know that more than 50% of cases of recovery from addiction in the United States are accounted for because of 12-step programs?
I would have assumed that number was higher.
Yeah, it is higher, but at least 50%. At least 50%. It's the one area within mental health that it's actually kosher, so to speak, funny, to have spirituality and religion as a part of the discussion. When it comes to anxiety, when I was learning how to do cognitive and dialectical behavior therapy with people with anxiety, people with depression, people with personality disorders, it was barely discussed. Maybe a little bit in DBT, in dialectical behavior therapy, a little bit, but very little. Very little. But when it comes to addictions, it's like, a huge part of the conversation. I think that's happened more for historic reasons than for actual mental health reasons, psychological reasons. And I want to bring that discussion and those concepts of spiritual nature into the treatment and dealing with anxiety as well. I think it's done such a great thing for the world when it comes to addictions, and we're not tapping into it explicitly in the anxiety space.
If you guys will indulge me, I'd like to share a little personal story about many of those steps actually that you brought up. But as you're saying it, it just kept coming up in my mind, and I wanted to share it. David, just for a little context, my anxiety manifested as an actor when I was on stage. I started to have, it wasn't stage fright per se, but I used to feel sick. I used to feel nauseous.
Sure.
And I would fight it all, as shows, we'd be warming up for the show, and I can feel this tension in my throat, trying to swallow this feeling away. I had a great castmate who was older than me, and I looked up to him, and I told him about what was happening, and he would walk me through breathing exercises before every show. Exposure, I was out there. I mean, I had to go to the show every single night, things like that. But there was a very specific moment that I remember that didn't seem pivotal at the time, but I still think about it 25 years later. I had to sing "Black Magic Woman" by Santana in this show, and I had this there's this big guitar lead up, and then everything stops, and I sing the first line, which I'm not going to sing because I don't want us to get censored. But it was like this moment where I was like, if I open my mouth at this moment, I'm going to throw up. And I would prepare myself for this moment to sing the song and swallow, and I looked horrible on stage. And I remember one night, I'd done the show for 4 months or something, and I remember one night I said, I'm going to go throw up on stage. I'm just going to let it go. I'm going to let's see what the worst that's going to happen. It'll be horrible, like you say. Yeah. It'll be embarrassing for the audience. It'll be terrible. But I'm just going to do it because I can't can't fight this anymore. It's so awful. And I went out and I like didn't do any of the trying to relaxing my throat. I didn't do it. And I just opened my mouth and I just sang and I didn't throw up. And it was a moment of like, and it literally, I felt it wash. I felt it go behind me. I felt all the anxiety go behind me because I was like, it's back there. The first word, black magic, and it was gone. And I still dealt with the anxiety through the run of the show, and I went into therapy after that and learned to deal with it. But that moment was a moment of clarity for me where I go, it isn't, I let go. And it didn't cure everything, but it certainly showed me that my worst fears weren't based in fact. They were only based in anxiety. They were based in an unrealistic expectation of what was going to happen and how everyone was going to judge me and all these things. And it was such a cleansing moment for me. So I concur completely with your step of letting go, because I think it helped me so much see that I could get past it. There was work ahead of me to do, and I did the work. But that moment was really pivotal in my journey, in my recovery.
I love what you said about doing exposure, so to speak. Mm-hmm. You are on stage, you're doing it every night, multiple
I signed
nights.
A contract. I had to be there.
I got to do this. Like I'm facing my fears, I'm embracing, but that wasn't enough.
Nope.
And I've seen it. I'm a huge fan of exposure therapy. Behavior therapy is, that was what I was brought up on in clinical psychology. But there is another cognitive step, an emotional step, maybe even a spiritual step that people need to take, which is that resignation, a positive resignation. They're like, can I really accept this outcome?
I was ready. I was ready to puke on stage.
You did it.
That definitely...
And it didn't happen, by the way. And it didn't happen.
Yeah.
Well, that term used to drive me nuts when people say you got to give up control to gain control, because I couldn't even wrap my head around that. I'm a control freak by nature. But you realize that it's the attempt to control that ends up being the problem.
It's
right?
like
it's
squeezing a hose, and you're
Yeah.
squeezing it tighter, and the water's spraying harder because you're putting more pressure on it. You think you're like stopping the flow, but you're just intensifying it.
Right.
It's when you reach that place of acceptance and letting go that all of a sudden you realize you have more control as a result of that letting go of control.
A lot of people have tied these devices to anxiety, right? These little electronic appendages that we all carry around. And there's no question there's correlation that we've seen a spike of anxiety since the proliferation of these incredible devices. I think this is the reason. It's not because of the devices. It's that they give us an illusion of control and of knowledge. We're predicting things all the time, right? When's the last time you had an interaction with someone that you scheduled an event with someone and didn't use a GPS locator to be able to figure out how many steps it is, right? How many feet it is? What's the incline that, Google Maps tells you exactly. Like we're so used to having knowledge and control at our fingertips that we become very unused. It's very counterintuitive to let go now. And I think that's the reason for the anxiety epidemic. It's the culture that this has created as opposed to the actual devices.
Ryan, I was curious if you had any moments like that in Maroon 5, or it didn't happen until you went through recovery and therapy. But did you have any moments where you were like, I have to let go, I have to give into this because otherwise I'm going to literally pass out or something? Were there any moments like that for you during your struggle?
Yeah, well, first off, let me say, David, that you named a chapter in my book, The Illusion of Control, which is a chapter in Harder to Breathe. I know that's not a term I invented.
Available now on Amazon, wherever fine books are sold.
But I love that because it applies to addiction, it applies to anxiety, it applies to just issues we all deal with in society, as you described. This illusion of control and thinking that you can we spend so much time focusing on things that we actually have no control over. We forget to focus on the things that we do have control over. And so that redirection from the things I don't have control over, that's the serenity prayer that offers that wisdom. But yes, to answer your question, Duck, this story is actually in my book as well, but it was in recovery, very early recovery, when I was at the Betty Ford Center. And well, there's a backstory to this that now I'm realizing kind of dovetails with a lot of things that we're talking about today. One of the last sort of really painful moments of my panic disorder and alcoholism came at a Passover Seder, believe it or not, of all things. Yeah, the Passover Seder was a family event that we had every year of my life since I was a baby. It was a big extended family affair. And every single year since I was old enough and able to read, we'd go around the table and I would read a section from the Seder. And even in my drinking years, I looked forward to it because I'd be drunk and I'd be like, yeah, I'm going to read. I'm going to be really cool. And I'm sure my image of what I was sounding like was different than how I was being perceived. However, this particular year must have been around 2015, 2016. Okay. I was in that final stage of alcoholism and severe anxiety disorder where I was just white knuckling it, like trying to not drink and then failing and going through like a week or two of not drinking and just having panic attacks every day. And this was one of those days where I was not drinking and I was not going to drink at this event. But the second I walked in the door, I was shaking like a leaf. I was around all of my extended family. I was sure that everyone could tell that I was a mess. Mm-hmm. And I was like, well, I just got to get through this. I can go home and I'll drink when I get home. You know, it's like that kind of a thing. But I'm sitting there at the table. It's too late to go run to the bar and get a drink now. And I'm realizing as we're going around to read, I'm starting to have a full-on panic attack. My hands are shaking. I'm trying to hold the piece of paper in front of me to read from. And I'm realizing it's going to be very obvious that I'm not holding it together. My voice is going to shake. My hands are shaking. And so I just got up and walked out and went into another room. And I ended up like curled up in the fetal position, just like intense. In a full-on panic attack. My dad ended up coming and finding me and asking me what was going on. He and my brother like escorted me out the front door. I ended up leaving the Seder and not coming back, and they just gave some excuse I wasn't feeling well or something like that. So that was just a real bottom for me in terms of just the embarrassment, the shame of what I was dealing with. And it had to do with performance. And performance was a lot of my trauma as a drummer, dealing with how I broke down in that regard. So that was a real trigger point for me. Now, fast forward to being in recovery at the Betty Ford Center. About a week or two in, I'm still just kind of feeling really anxious, but excited to be there, feeling like I'm starting to get my feet underneath me and feeling the support of my peers. I walk into the morning lecture hall one morning, and a guy walks over to me with the big book of AA and says, hey, you want to read in front of the group today? There's 150 people in the lecture hall at Betty Ford, up at the dais or whatever you call it, the lectern. And I was like, oh, no. There's no way I could do that. I have terrible anxiety. It's no way. And he's like, oh, well, then you have to do it.
Oh, no.
This is your first time at Fight Club.
Oh, God.
Yeah.
You have to fight.
So I stagger up there. I'm standing at the lectern. I open up the book to the page that I'm supposed to read from. And immediately I'm feeling my hands shaking, and then it starts going into my body. Like, you know that feeling when your knees are shaking so hard, you feel like I'm not even going to be able to stand. I'm going to fall over. And I start to speak, and I notice my voice is warbling. I could almost not even get the words out. And in that moment, I had a choice. I could either do what I did at the Seder, which was to run away and just not face the situation, or to accept what was going on and let go of the wheel and just let it be what it was going to be. And so what I did was I just paused for a moment. I looked up, I looked around the room, I soaked in all the people in the audience, and I said, I'm really sorry, guys. I have like severe anxiety disorder. I'm having a panic attack right now. I'm going to try to get through this, but I don't know if I can. And I don't know what response I was expecting, but immediately everyone started cheering for me. They started going, Ryan, you got this. And it was like, it dawned on me in that moment, like, we're all here for the same reason. We're all going through, maybe not in particular the exact same symptoms, but we're all struggling in various ways. And this thing that I was alone with, this thing that felt like I was just drowning up here, once I let go of it and just owned it, and it was like, this is my experience, and I'm going to let everyone into it. I would love to say that it went away completely, that the anxiety went away, but just like you described in your story, Doug, it allowed me to get through that moment, and it was freeing because what turned in that moment in terms of mindset was to realize the way through this was through it. It was to stop trying to control it or avoid it or run away from it. And and escape it in the ways that I'd tried with alcohol, with avoidance behavior. It was partly exposure therapy. It was partly just letting go and giving it up to something bigger than myself, which in that moment was
sharing, by the way,
and sharing with another or 150 other human beings. Yeah.
Amazing.
I love that story. Yeah, I'm sorry you went through that, but I love the resolution.
So David, so in the two worlds that you walk in is in your faith, are you working with people? What is your life in terms of your faith at this point? Is it a separate world from the work that you're doing, or because you have a lot of books you have one in particular that's called The Connections Paradigm, Ancient Jewish Wisdom for Modern Mental Health, the Handbook of Torah and Mental Health.
Those are more specifically in the Jewish community. Those are two books. Actually, the one is a little more broad. I would say it's very much integrated, but I would say even in some ways it's more integrated than ever. Like I feel like it's not a separate part of my life. It's something that's really shaping the way I experience the world and the way I try to make it a better place. I was going to tell my own story.
Please do.
And I think it's related. I think it's related to anxiety also, to spirituality also. When I started Center for Anxiety, we had some major headwinds. I was going there once a week and seeing a single patient. Right, it wasn't enough money to cover my train ticket. Okay, one day I get out of the train station and the only patient on my caseload canceled his session. I was just, why am I doing this? I can't believe it. This is such a stupid idea. Why didn't I just stay in Boston? Why didn't I start something anxiety in Boston? Why did I have to come to New York? And, for me, spirituality helped me to let go, to be able to, I was facing it, like both of your points. I was sharing it with my wife, with my spiritual mentors. I was certainly identifying exactly what could go wrong. But for me, the spiritual aspect really helped me to be like, okay, there's only so much I can do at this point. This is happening for a reason, and can I just lean into it? I accepted for the first time in my life that I might fail professionally, and it could be okay. It could be okay to fail professionally. Mm-hmm. It's not the end of my life. There's other aspects of my life. And can I actually let go of that need right now? Still something I grapple with, but it was definitely a piece of it. So, to answer your question, Ryan, going back to that, I think spirituality is sort of, it's both in the background and in the foreground, but it's not in your face. I mean, it's in the book on anxiety, of course, and the other work that I do, but it's not in your face. It's more informing my approach in a real way, in an integrated way, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Are there places where that anxiety still rears its head for you? I mean, obviously, as a
yes.
I know the answer, but I want to hear it. As a mental health professional and as someone with this spiritual background, you would think that you have those tools now at your fingertips, but there must be places where that stuff still creeps up. And I'm curious what those moments are for you and what they look like.
The way I think about it is this, the moments are never going to go away, but I do get better at handling them, and I handle them at higher levels now than I ever have. Mm-hmm. So now being an author and an academician and having an anxiety center, with staff and, dealing with other, just pieces of my life, it's more sort of juggling in the mix. It's sort of like being in the gym. Like I feel like I've bulked up and I feel like I'm more fit now than I was, but I don't feel that way. I feel winded. I feel the pain of my muscles burning, but that just means that I'm getting fitter than I currently am. It doesn't mean that I'm not fit.
Gotcha.
So yeah, always just trying to push higher. Just keep going.
You mentioned speaking. What capacities are you doing public speaking?
So have a couple. Have a TEDx actually coming up. Talking about anxiety, I have a TEDx coming up in Nashville. In about a week and a half. I'll be sharing the four steps there. Hopefully, it's part of my script. So that is very much like walking off a cliff. I mean, that is terrifying, completely terrifying. Big crowd and not like anything I've done before. Very short period of time. You have to memorize the speech. A lot of issues like that to face. Just trying to spread the word about this approach with anxiety and add value. A lot of people need it, myself included.
Well, I think you've shared. I mean, like I love it when I've mentioned this before. I love it when guests have tangible goals that listeners can use and that we can use that aren't just kind of concepts. They are specific things that you can do to help deal with this stuff. Like I said, even the first step of getting out of the house or exercising, whatever it is, it's things that are really helpful. So I really appreciate you taking the time and sharing that stuff with us and with our listeners today.
My great pleasure.
Yeah, David, thank you. This has been really an enlightening and fascinating conversation, and I appreciate that it was a conversation that we were able to engage in the ways that we did. I think today was helpful for me. You know,
Me too.
So thank you for your time. Is there anything else you want to talk about, promote, or anything before we sign off?
No, just want to thank the both of you for the work that you're doing. If people want to follow me, I'm at DH Rosmarin, my last name, .com. Very happy to engage with people around the book, around other things related to anxiety. And Center for Anxiety is centerforanxiety.org.
We'll put those addresses on the screen of the YouTube video too. So thank you, Dave.
Thank you kindly.
All right, Dr. David Rosmarin, thank you very much. This has been another wonderful conversation on the Harder to Breathe podcast. Check out new episodes every Tuesday. We'll see you next time right here on the Harder to Breathe podcast. Take care.
See ya.